Very few games can be enjoyed by all ages equally, but one game stands out not just as a great game for both young and old, but also as one of the most creative games ever made. This, of course, was Little Big Planet. And when I heard they had a sequel coming out, I pre-ordered the collector's edition months in advance, despite my usual disinterest in the random clutter that comes packaged in a box that's 20 times the size of the actual game. And when I took it home, I jumped at the chance to review it. From the get-go, you'll notice significant increases in the complexity of the backgrounds and various contraptions from what you experienced in the first game. And once you run through a couple of quick tutorials, you're dropped into your pod, which should feel pretty familiar if you played the first game. Not just because it uses the same user interface, but also because Little Big Planet 2 imports all of your pod's previous customizations, so that appears exactly how you left it. And as you explore further, you'll notice that your Sackboy also retains all of the items and accessories that you collected in your last visit to Little Big Planet as well. This feature is really something I wish more games had. Throughout the first several levels, you'll be introduced to many new additions to the gameplay, in the form of brief tutorials followed by a level that reinforces what you've learned. And while it's nice to have new gameplay mechanics, playing through so many training levels gets a bit tiring after a while. But ultimately, you need the tutorials simply because they've added so much. You'll now be navigating levels with the help of various power-ups such as grappling hooks, gloves that allow you to pick up other objects as well as your friends, and cannons that fire, well, baked goods. Now each of these additions are a lot of fun, but they also have their own frustrations. The grappling hook suffers a bit due to the game's physics. Several times I found myself spending far too long struggling to swing over a bubble containing a new item, only to lose my momentum just as I was about to reach my prize. The gloves, however, make it a lot easier to reach items, mainly by throwing your friends around. But they also make it very easy to pick up a friend by mistake and then inadvertently throw them into a pit of fire. Even the cakes get annoying when you have too many players firing cakes all over the screen and causing them to get in the way of your objective. But all in all, these additions do make the game more interesting than the first one and are a welcome improvement. Another major improvement in the sequel is the addition of vehicles. In the first game they had vehicles, but they're mostly based off grabbing different materials and operating things that way. However, in Little Big Planet 2, you can now create vehicles that you can operate simply by hopping on and taking over control. And the types of vehicles vary. There can be cars, animals, spaceships, it doesn't matter. And adding vehicles can change the gameplay entirely. It can turn it from a platformer to a racing game or even a side-scrolling shooter. And unlike the various power-ups that they've added to the sequel, the vehicles have very few frustrations because they do operate smoothly, and they really help to break up the monotony of constant platforming that the first game had. Other than the increase in power-ups, it seems the difficulty has also been increased a bit. Not to the point where it's frustrating, but it can be a problem when you're playing with friends, especially when you have one less skilled Sackboy on your team who's repeatedly jumping to their death and using up the group's shared bank of lives. But I won't mention any names. Chris! Now I know Little Big Planet 2 doesn't exactly have the most complex story, but they have changed how they tell it, using improved cutscenes and more lively characters to give you information on your objectives. However, you will occasionally want them to just shut up and let you play the game, rather than sitting through a minute or so of cutscenes every few areas. The game also sports a larger amount of story levels than the first one, but eventually you are going to finish them. Which brings me to the level creator. In the first game I found myself looking at the clock in horror to see how much time I had poured into my levels. Except this time around, there's so much more you can do. The only downside is that there is simply a ton of stuff to learn before you can really go all out with it. And it can get frustrating when something isn't working right because you miss some small detail. But I for one will have to put in the effort, so look forward to some final boss levels sometime in the future. In the end, despite all the small frustrations that you run into throughout the game, Media Molecule has done an extraordinary job creating Little Big Planet 2. And that earns them an 8.5 out of 10.